Today I'll be doing my Insane in the Endgame lecture. And I wanted to do it on this game between Alekseenko and Grischuk from the candidates tournament this year. I'd like to use lots of candidate games because they're just kind of nice games to use, but also it's like the main slow tournament that's happened. And in general, I think, classical chess tournaments, like these are the games where you can learn the most from. Because it's fun to follow the Rapid and the Blitz, especially live. I really enjoy it, and I like watching those tournaments. And of course, Blitz and stuff like that can be really fun to watch, but it's also, how do I put this, I guess? Like, it's harder to learn from the games because oftentimes there are lots of blunders and things like this, which is cool to watch and it's entertaining. But I would say games like this are very, very instructive to go over slowly and to take your time on. So I really enjoy looking at these games. And this one had quite an interesting endgame that it featured with chances for both sides and just really, really exciting. And I also partially chose this game because in the future I'm going to be doing an arena with for the chess Twitch stream. And for that, I'm going to kind of have everyone play from a position in this game. And that's kind of a cool concept. And I thought this game would be good for that because it is a double-edged position where both sides have chances. So it's kind of a nice position to play from. In any case, welcome everyone. I am monitoring the YouTube chat. Let me just type so you know I'm here. So if you guys do say things, I'm mostly going to be lecturing, but I will ask questions and I will be looking for your answers. Hey, Chess King. And hi, anyone else who is here. So let's start, I suppose, with the opening, which is not a usual thing I do in endgame lectures. But the opening actually directly leads to an endgame, which I find is very, very interesting. So Alekseenko plays e4. It's a French defense. Grischuk, just so you guys have some background knowledge to the game, if you weren't following the candidates, first of all, it's a great tournament to follow. I always recommend. But I would say that Alekseenko was already like tied for last or close, so he didn't really have any shot to try to win. Whereas Grischuk, I believe, had lost his previous game, and the only way he could ever hope to fight for first was to win. So Grischuk really had to win this game, whereas for Alekseenko, it was less of a must-win and more of just a normal tournament game. So just for some background, so that's part of why probably Grischuk chose the French instead of a maybe more solid opening. Although, to be fair, he does play sharply with black anyway, and the French is one of his main weapons. Not main weapons, I guess. The Knight Off is probably more of a main weapon. All right. Did. So Knight F6, E5, Knight D7, F4. And I just wanted to go over the opening because it's quite an interesting one. So C5, Knight D6, Bishop E3, and then CD, Knight D4. So in this position, there's a main line, right? And that one goes with Bishop C5, and then there are many different options, but it usually goes Queen D2, and then either castles or A6, B5 at some point, and things like this. So it goes something like this, and it's very complex, and these positions are very, very complicated to understand. But it does offer chances for both sides, but this isn't how Grischuk intended to do it. He actually played the move Queen B6 here. And this move is extremely double-edged in many ways. And it leads to a very unbalanced position because it kind of forces white to sacrifice a pawn. And I would say that at the very top level, they trot out this line once in a while when they want to surprise their opponent, because it's one of those lines where if you've reviewed it recently and have a new idea, you can have a big edge over someone who hasn't looked at it. And it's very likely that Alekseenko hadn't reviewed this line quite as recently as Grischuk had. So it's kind of a nice surprise weapon if you're trying to win. But of course it's risky because you're going to grab this b2 pawn. So because of the pin on the knight on d4, white has no choice but to play queen d2. Queen takes b2, rook b1, queen a3. And now there are a few options, but the main move is actually to play bishop b5. So basically white's not trying to do anything immediate, they're just trying to develop their pieces and get an initiative. So a move like knight cb5 looks quite natural, and it looks like, oh, I'm going to fork you on c7, but the problem is queen takes a2 hits the rook on b1, so this means that it's not possible. All right, welcome Dallas. Salute. All right. So bishop b5 instead was played, which is quite normal. And yes, for those just joining, this is not an endgame yet, but it will become an endgame very soon. So in this position, believe it or not, you can actually play the move knight db8. And I remember for a very brief time, this was actually a thing. This was a major thing. But it looks very unnatural. And of course, white has potential for a huge initiative here when you play a move like this. So instead, black takes and plays a6, which is the main idea. And the whole point is that you're actually going to sacrifice this b7 pawn. Bishop takes d7 check. And taking with the king's a bit suicidal. I would not recommend it. So they take with the bishop. And now there's a nice little finesse. If you try to take the b7 pawn immediately, then bishop b4 is kind of a nice move. And the whole idea is that black's a little, like, not quite ready to castle yet because d7 hangs, but they can play rook c8, they can play bishop c6 or bishop c8. They have lots of options, and this is not really what white wants. So it's very important you actually attack the queen first. And the whole point is that there is no really great square. To warm you up a little bit, e7 is what was played in the game, which is the main move, and the reason why is because if queen a5, something very unfortunate happens to you. So just to make sure you guys are paying attention, what happens to black if you play queen a5? Just to see if we got people who are alive in the audience. I always like to ask these questions first. Anyone? If I don't get an answer in a minute or so, I'll just show you. But I always like to give you guys a chance. Oh, hey, Doug, by the way. I'm reading the YouTube chat. I did not know there was another chat, actually. So if there's another chat, I am quite sorry. But yes. Bishop b6 is correct. And yeah, that queen is trapped. So just making sure you guys know. Okay. So queen e7 is the main move here. Rook takes b7. And now there are two moves. Like queen h4 check is what was played in the game. Rook c8 is also a move here. And then usually white castles. And then black moves the queen somewhere, develops the bishop. And again, it's a pretty big initiative for white, but positionally black's doing well. And that's kind of the whole point. That's why it's a double-edged position, because you can see black has the two bishops and the c-pawn is quite weak on c2, whereas black's pawn structure is nice. But of course, black lacks in development. So it's the big battle of, can you use your initiative? If you can't use your initiative, sometimes in the long term, black can even be better. But black can also get absolutely destroyed if they're not careful. So it's one of those where you have to be on your toes for both sides. And it's why Grischuk chose this for a must-win game as black. So queen h4 check was instead played. And here, almost everyone plays the move bishop f2. And which makes sense when you're trying to keep an initiative, right? You want to keep pieces on the board. You attack the queen. Queen goes back to d8. And now usually white plays the move bishop b6. And the idea now is that black doesn't really want to play queen h4 now. With the bishop on b6, it's going to be kind of annoying to ever do anything. So you play queen c8, rook c7, and then queen back to d8, believe it or not. And then white can, of course, repeat and draw. That's the one drawing line here. But you can also play queen d4. And this line is just a mess. Like, this position is so complicated, and it's been analyzed to death. But Alekseenko had a very different idea here, which was to play queen f2. And at first, this seems like a bad idea, because you're trying to play for the endgame when you're the one who depends on initiative. In this kind of position, white's the one who needs to play for initiative, because positionally in the long term, they're worse. But one of the misconceptions I find that people have about the endgame is that the initiative means so much less than the middle game. Yes, you don't get mated usually, or at least not horribly so. But the initiative can still be very, very powerful in an endgame and still be very relevant. So I would say that the fact that white's going to have an initiative that carries over to the endgame doesn't mean that queen f2 is actually that bad. So black does take on f2. Bishop e7 is kind of a more natural move in some ways because you're trying to develop and not give up a tempo. But the problem with this is that now white can choose to play g3. And after queen h3, even a move like king d2 is annoying. So you're trying to get the rook on h1 into the game with rook hb1. And the king still can't castle because the bishop on d7 would hang. So you have to play something. I'm not exactly sure what they would try here, but it's very difficult to find a reasonable move, I feel. Because you'd like to play a move like bishop c6, but then I play rook c7 and you've actually accomplished nothing. And bishop c8 is just very, very risky, I think. Even sacks on e7 become viable sometimes. In general, I would be very, very worried with the... I would be very, very worried with the black pieces here. So it's very understandable that Grischuk took on f2. And I don't know how much this was prepped by either side, but I feel like a move like queen f2 you would have to prepare, because trading the queens does feel like something that's not so easy. So king takes f2. Bishop to e7. And here I think that Alekseenko makes a mistake and starts to let Grischuk really into the game very well. So he plays an idea which I feel is a very nice positional idea, and I know exactly what he's going for, but it's also extremely slow. And one of the things I find is that when you're in a position where you're trying to play for initiative, like in this position, white needs to have an initiative here, right? Because in the long term, positionally, black's doing quite well with the two bishops in the backward c-pawn. So white tries to play a positional idea, but to me, this does not feel like a position where you should do that. This is more, in my eyes, a position where you should be trying to actually still play tactically and aggressively. So what move comes to mind for you guys for white? Because a move just leaps to mind for me, and for the life of me, I can't figure out what's wrong with the move. What would you guys think of playing here with white? Because, again, to me, it just... Rook to a7, but rook a7 has the same drawback, right? If you try to move rook a7, then I'll play rook takes rook and castle. And the problem you have here is that you've traded off some pieces and dulled your initiative a little bit. So the rook's going to probably come out to c8 next, for example, and it's just not going to be very pleasant for you. So I would say that when you have such an active rook, like the beautiful rook on b7, regardless of whether you're playing for initiative right away or not, you don't want to trade that off, that rook, for the passive rook on a8. Almost never do you want to do this. So yeah, rook hb1 is what all of you guys would probably play really quickly, right? Like, I think that's what I would play. It's probably what Alekseenko would play. And this is one of those cases where the dangers of playing classical chess, where you sometimes have too much time to think. Because I think that either it was something prepared, which I just don't really understand, or it was just like you got too much time to think and you overthink the position. Just play rook hd1 and b1. And I feel like white has good chances here because black just doesn't have a great way to untangle with these bishops. So for example, I thought about bishop d8, but now you can play rook b8, takes, and castles, but you're still quite tied up here. So for example, after rook b7, bishop c6, you can play the move rook a7, and that pawn is still quite juicy on a6, just kind of waiting. And I don't know, this still looks quite dangerous, to me at least, for black. Maybe back here, playing bishop c8 would be a bit better. But even here, you can play rook back to b6, for instance, castles, and even just a building move like king e3, just to improve your king position. And it's just hard for black to play. Like, you can play bishop d8, you can play bishop d7, but then rook back to b7, right? And it's really annoying. Like, you just don't have that many moves. So even though technically white's allowed black to castle, there's still some initiative here. And I feel like this position would actually be very difficult to play for black. So I'm not really clear on why Alekseenko declined to do this. Of course, he's, a much stronger player than I am. I'm sure he had his reasons. But at least to my eyes, his move just looks way too slow. And that move is knight d1. So to be fair to him, he has a very decent and reasonable idea, which is to play knight e3. And then the knight on e3 is very well placed, and he's ready to play c4 and rook back out to b1. But what I don't like about it, which you guys probably guess, is that it's just very slow. And when you're in a position where your opponent has these positional trumps, like the beautiful pawn structure and the two bishops, you don't really want to play slow moves unless you have to, or unless the quicker moves don't really do too much. So bishop d8 was played, so Grischuk's trying to get his king castled. It feels weird to try so hard to castle in an endgame, but the fact is that his king on e8 is really badly placed because it keeps the rook on h8 out of the game. So he wants to be able to castle in order to get his rook into the game. So it's funny because it's an endgame, but it feels more like a middle game still because there's so many pieces on the board. And you find that this is true quite often. So knight e3 was played, bishop to c6, rook to b2, castles. And here Alekseenko plays the move bishop c5. So I think what he didn't want was a move like f6 being played while his king was still on f2. And that's definitely awkward. The knight on e3 looks nice, but it does block the king from going to its really nice e3 square. So avoiding f6 is actually something that he wants. So he at least forces the rook to go to the e8 square. And now he completes his idea. He plays c4. Well, g4, f5 is possible. So if we're going way back here. So if we go for g4, the problem is you're still actually not playing that quick of an idea. So even here, like, I don't think f5 is actually doing a whole lot. So maybe I can play my bishop d8 move again, for instance. Maybe bishop c8 again. Yeah, bishop c8 maybe is the move, because now the rook has to kind of go away. And the whole point is that you can play a move like rook c7, but I can play bishop d8, and your rook has to leave. So probably you should retreat with your rook, either b6 or even back to b3 if you'd prefer. But now I'm able to castle, and the problem is that f5 is just not doing enough, I feel like. If you play f5, I could think about taking, although that allows knight takes d5. But more probably, I would think about playing a move like f6. And once again, your king on f2 is kind of feeling the heat, and your pieces are a little bit miscoordinated, in my opinion. So I don't really like this idea. Someone else had a really great point in the audience, which is that doesn't c4 open up the bishop on c6? And that's absolutely true. So c4 in some ways is a double-edged move, but it's also trading off a very, very bad weakness on the c-pawn. And I would also say that it activates the knight. So because of these two factors, I think opening up the bishop is actually justified here. The reason being, like, if d takes c4, knight takes c4, the knight can land on d6, where it's going to be a very, very powerful piece, right? c3 and put the knight on d4 is a nice idea, but the problem with it is also that it's still very slow and gives black time. So for example, here I could think about, again, playing f6. And yes, you can play knight c2 to d4, and the knight looks really beautiful there. But then you also need to make sure your e-pawn's defended and your king's not in danger. And I think that you're going to find it's going to be too slow. So once again, speed really matters in these positions because black has a lot of potential with the two bishops here. So you have to be very cautious and you have to play in a timely manner. So c4 I really like for this reason. And here, once again, Grischuk, like, takes knight takes c4. This kind of position I feel is very safe for black. Like, even if a knight lands on d6, there's nothing horrible that's going to happen. You could play a bunch of moves here, honestly, but even bishop c7 or something doesn't feel that bad to me. And the idea is if knight d6, even if you have to take it, you're not going to really lose with the opposite bishops there, probably. But you don't even have to, right? If knight d6, you could probably play rook b8 and the life kind of continues. But I don't know. I mean, I guess here it's very difficult to ever win is the problem. The knight on d6 is just really, really, really strong. So Grischuk decided to play the move f6. And this is very, very double-edged, but it's understandable because he wants to really open up his bishops very, very well. So I guess if Alekseenko wanted to play super safe, he could have put his bishop back on d4. And probably it's pretty safe for him. I don't think anything horrible is happening. But I guess, I mean, okay, black can play rook f8 if he wants. It's not like it's completely dead. But taking on d5 is a really legitimate idea now. So this would be a safe move. But he elected to take on d5 instead, which also I think is perfectly good. E takes d5. He doesn't want to give up his bishop, of course. And now bishop d6. And this move, again, has a very double-edged feel to it because that bishop is a monster. It controls so many squares that the rooks want to go to that it's really quite annoying. But it also allows the pawn on d5 to start running. And when the pawn on d5 starts running, it can become kind of an annoyance. Like, it's not going to really... it's not going to become a queen anytime soon, but it becomes a pest. It just takes away squares. It opens up the pieces. And that's exactly what Grischuk does. He takes on e5 first and plays d4. So this pawn, again, it's just very, very much a pest. And also it's taking away a key square from white's king. White's king is actually a little uncomfortable now. But the whole point here is that because the bishop on d6 is so strong, it means that it's really hard to take advantage. Like, you'd love to play rook f8 here, pinning the knight, but you can't because of the bishop. So it's a really interesting, really double-edged position that we have here. So the next bunch of moves are not forced, but very logical. They play d3. So white plays king e3, trying to hit the pawn. And black really doesn't want to give up this pawn. It's kind of his pride and joy now, I would say. Not that it's that strong, but it's very pesky, and it makes it difficult to deal with, right? So he plays bishop b5. So these kind of positions are really interesting because, like, white's the one who has the centralized king, the powerful bishop on d6, but these two bishops, it's kind of like black's looking for coordination. If black ever gets coordinated, if the bishops ever start really attacking white's king or supporting the d-pawn, white can get into trouble in a real hurry, because you can play something like, say, bishop g5 check followed by d2 and then bishop a4, and all of a sudden you're going to win a rook or something. Whereas at the same time, if white's careful, this bishop on d6 just makes it so difficult for black to do anything. But I'd say that these positions are one of those where the computer is very unhelpful in learning them, because it's kind of like it'll just say everything's equal, right? Which is nice, but it doesn't really tell you how to play this position and how to deal with it. So it's very, very tricky. So I think bishop g5 check is actually a worry for white here. So Alekseenko played king e4, just centralizing his king. He's not really in a rush to try to take this d-pawn, although he would definitely very much like to take it someday. So here Grischuk activates his rook with rook c8. Alekseenko plays knight to d4. Bishop to c4. And now rook d1. So white's trying to centralize, trying to make sure that pawn's controlled. Black's trying to keep his bishop. That bishop on c4 is actually a very, very nice piece, because it controls both pawns. It kind of keeps white's king at bay. So we have just a really, really interesting and kind of crazy position, because white's so centralized, but these two bishops have so much potential in open positions. And I can't stress that enough. If the two bishops can get kind of out and get really working, they can be particularly nasty. And then that's kind of what happens. So Grischuk plays a5. Again, I don't know if it's so much about pushing the pawn. It's more about taking away squares for the pieces. So for example, there's no piece coming to b4 anymore. There's no, I don't know. I mean, it's one of those kind of slightly odd moves. It also gives the bishop a square. So now the bishop has the a6 square. And I think that's the main purpose of this move, to be perfectly honest. That having bishop a6 as a resource is actually kind of nice. But okay, here there was actually an interesting choice. So I'm kind of curious what you guys would do here, because I think Alekseenko's move, I remarked about knight d1 being a bit of a slow move. I feel like his next move is also a bit of a slow move. Although, again, it's I wouldn't call it bad, right? Like, I think almost the thing with positions like this is they're actually very much within the draw zone, we would say, meaning that you can make a slightly small mistake and it's not going to cost you too much just yet, even though there's a lot of potential in the position. Like, things are still kind of on the even side. So I don't think one small mistake should cost white the game, or black. But I would definitely say that if you make a couple of them, you could end up really compromising your position. So what would you guys do here? I'm actually kind of curious. Because white had a very, very interesting possibility here, which I think maybe I would have gone for personally. I don't know. So what do you guys think? I agree, Chess King. I think Rook b7 is very interesting. Yeah, Rook d2 again is okay, but it's also kind of simplistic. And also, like, the problem with Rook d2 is that now you have to watch out for bishop g5 moves again. And I think bishop g5 may even be a legitimate move here, because you don't really want to allow the pawn to go to d2, right? So Rook b7 is actually really, really interesting. You allow bishop takes a2, but in return you get this pesky d-pawn. But quite honestly, I'm not really sure what's going on here. In general, for white, I really like taking this d-pawn because I think it frees your position. But maybe black can play a move like rook c1 here with the idea of bishop b1, and this actually is quite annoying. So maybe this was a possibility. Like, even moves like rook g3 are in the air here. But it's kind of weird. Like, black gets some strange coordination, but they're only playing with the rook and piece, right? Because the rook on e8 and the bishop on d8 really aren't doing much. So I'm not exactly sure what's happening, but it feels like it's at least a possibility. I don't know. But okay. So in this position, instead he did play a3. which Doug suggested, basically trying to play rook b7 but safeguarding the pawn first. The issue with this move, however, is that it is very slow. But this is where things are very strange. So Grischuk played the move g6, which is, again, a move I'm not so sure about. I kind of get it. You want to prevent knight f5, but it's a very committal move as well, because it does give up some squares, and your dark squares could really become a little bit iffy. But black had a very, very interesting possibility here, which I think was maybe missed at least by one of the players, but possibly by both. So I'm kind of curious what you guys think about it. So what would you do here as black? Black to move. So you have to think about it this way. You're really trying to exploit white's king position a little bit, and you're trying to coordinate your pieces. So chess king, a move like bishop c7 or bishop e7 looks very tempting, but there's actually a big problem with it. Let's say we play bishop e7. I think that there's a big problem with this move, in fact. Yes, knight f5, and all of a sudden, bishop takes d6 is an issue. Bishop takes d6, knight takes d6. Maybe you can try bishop f8, but this looks very, very sketchy. Because here, for example, even if I just play bishop takes bishop, you can't take with a rook because of knight check. So you have to take with a king, and now rook b7. And I don't know, this looks very like a knight coming into d6. Actually, you could play knight d6 immediately as well. This is maybe simpler. And this looks very, very irritating, to say the least. So this is just not a good thing to allow. And the same goes with bishop c7, right? Bishop c7, you play knight f5, and it's just too many threats. It's too annoying. So Sylvester had the right idea. You actually play bishop f6. And this move is really, really tricky, because at first, I looked at this move, but I didn't quite understand it myself, I must admit. So it was one of those where I had to look at it a lot deeper to kind of figure out what was going on. But the main point is that bishop takes e5 and rook c5 is actually a very nasty threat. For example, if you try to play rook b7, which is a reasonable try, here you can actually play rook d6, and you're noticing this bishop on d6 is actually all of a sudden a weakness. All of a sudden that bishop has problems. And it's because the king on e4, even though it looks great because it's centralized, it's actually not good. Because there's this huge pin. And actually white's already in trouble, because you can't move the bishop due to bishop d5 check, right? So bishop f6 actually seems really, really annoying. And if you play rook b6 to try to guard your bishop, to try to avoid that kind of thing, now I can play bishop takes e5, rook c5, you have to guard your bishop, and now I play bishop here, takes the knight, king takes, bishop takes. But luckily for white, they can still draw. This is probably what should have happened if black played this. You'd play rook b8. And this endgame should be a draw. Although white's the one fighting for it. So bishop f4 is coming, and if bishop f3, nice little last try. This is a typical endgame trick, because if you take, then I play d2 and I queen. So black has to play bishop back to white has to play bishop back to f4, takes. But this endgame should definitely be drawn. I mean, opposite bishops, and white's king is very, very strong. So I think the clearest way to draw this is by playing not king d4. It is king d4. If you play king b5, I think black actually just brings their king to the center, and then this king can help support the d-pawn. I still think this should be drawn, but it's at least a little bit trickier. So I think king d4 is best, because now you force the bishop back, and now you can play a4 and just go after this pawn. And most likely, because the a-pawn is so nasty, probably black should actually just go here, and we should shake hands after something like this, because this extra pawn will not be won with, right? So bishop f6 is like a really, really crazy crazy move. And again, it's not that it's like winning, right? But it forces white to take a draw like right away. And maybe Grischuk saw it and simply didn't want white to be able to force the draw. It's also possible. I should point out that after rook b6, you don't have to play takes on e5 right away, but it is your main idea. So I think that once again, maybe Grischuk wanted to try to keep chances alive. So he played g6. And to his credit, it actually did work out for him. So rook b7. He plays bishop f6 now, but now it's a little bit different because you don't... White already has the rook on b7, so you're not really... You're not really in time to do any of this, right? So for example, here, if you try to play rook d8, I think I can just sidestep you with king f4, and you're not really doing much of anything. Whereas in the other position, just to contrast for you guys, if bishop f6 here, and you go for this same line that I showed you, king f4 doesn't work because you can simply take this bishop. And if you take, then I take on the knight. So because the knight on d4 kind of hangs, this whole tempo really matters. So if you guys can take away anything from this, it's that you have to be very quick, especially in a tactical position. It's very possible. Maybe Grischuk just thought like he could outplay him. And again, I think he more thought that, not that Alekseenko is a weak player, because he's by no means weak, but more that he has to try to outplay him because he needs to win this game. So he plays bishop g7 here. And here, I don't know. I would have probably tried something like h4 for white, with the idea that now if a move like rook c6, you sidestep with king f4. And the whole point is that now you can play knight g5 to block bishop h6 check ideas. It's kind of hard to crack white's position now. But it's kind of a tricky position because I don't think white has any major improving moves. And those positions are always really tricky because you have to find a move that doesn't harm your position. He plays rook a7, which definitely makes a lot of sense. But it does allow black a very, very strong possibility, which I think he neglected to play. So what possibility does black have now, which is maybe quite good? What do you guys think? A4 is very interesting, but it also doesn't really force anything. Like, I think white has several options after A4. Because, yes, the idea of A4, right, is that if you play A4 and I play rook takes pawn, you can play bishop B3 and fork the rooks, and you look very smart. The drawback with A4 is that it's, again, a slower move. So white does have an opportunity to play something like, I'm not exactly sure what you would try, but... maybe a move like rook b1 would be dangerous, because now rook b7 is no joke. That's a very dangerous move. So I don't know. This might pose some problems for black, in fact. So, I mean, you can try blocking the rook, but then I can take your pawn. Oh, no, I can't take your pawn. Aha. Maybe this is a good move. But now I can play knight d4 and hit your bishop, maybe? But then d2? Oh, no, this is probably too dangerous. Yeah, so maybe bishop b3 is too strong after that. That's a good point. So you guys are mentioning rook cd8 threatening the bishop. That's what he played in the game, but I think that it actually wasn't maybe the best move. And we'll get to that in a moment. But let's see a4, because actually this is quite tricky. What would I do here? Maybe knight d2 is not so silly, because I'm just trying to get this bishop out of my face, basically. Because that bishop is just annoying me quite a bit. So I'm just trying to get the bishop away. Trying to get it so it doesn't bother me so much anymore. So maybe this is actually a decent move. And what I like about this is because I'm attacking the bishop, you don't have time to attack my bishop on d6. So maybe knight d2 is actually quite decent here. What do you guys think? So yeah, maybe a4 is a bit slow. But again, like, I would say that one habit you guys want to get into is you want to look at your forcing moves before you look at moves like a4. Because a4 might be a great move, but it's also slower. So you want to look at a4 after you look at moves that are attacking moves. And I would say that there's a very, very strong attacking move. Maybe, but I feel like when the bishop gets to b3, knight d2 is going to be harder to make work. But knight d2 immediately, I think, works pretty well. So what could we try here as black? Again, look for forcing moves, right? Bishop b3, very nice. So you play bishop b3, and I think white should sack the exchange, because if you play the move rook d2 and I play bishop c2, the problem is that bishop h6 is coming, and you're probably going to have to lose that rook anyway. Because there's just no real course of action that, like, you can't really do anything to black here. And once you allow this, it could be very, very dangerous. So I don't think rook d2 actually helps you. So you probably have to take this pawn and allow bishop c2. I should point out that taking the exchange is not really the end of the world. The bigger problem that white faces here is that his pieces are very discoordinated, in fact. So for example, if you play the move king d4, if you were to take this rook, then king takes bishop, and I don't really think white's doing so badly here. You can take on a5, you can bring your king back. I don't see why white would be unhappy here. The problem is that black can play a move like rook c6, and believe it or not, the king just has no good square. You're threatening to take this bishop with check, and the king just doesn't have a safe square, which is quite funny. So a move like rook c6 would actually be quite nice. Rook d8 is also possible, but it allows the king to escape to the c file. You could play king c3, for instance, and I think that would be like something they wouldn't want to allow. So rook c6 is kind of a clever version of that. In any case, I don't think king d4 is best. I think king e3 is better. So you've provoked bishop h6 check, then king d4, because now, because there's no pin on your pawn, your rook c6 doesn't threaten anything. So black would have to take, and takes. And again, I think because of the pawn and bishop, it's quite good compensation here. Again, I still think black could have gone for this. Like this, it feels like a better option at least. Maybe you can play with bishop f8, try to trade off the bishop, like a rook d8 next, for example. It at least feels like a better choice, right? But I don't know. I mean, it was at least something to consider. I think he didn't. One thing you'll notice with GMs in general is that we don't mind sacking exchanges at all, and especially if we have a pawn on e5 and rook on bishop on d6. So it could be that he just felt that position is not good enough. You know, that he maybe even if he's better, he's not going to be able to win. Which is fair enough. He chose rook cd8 instead. And here, I think after king f4, white's kind of doing okay. It definitely has a dangerous feel to it, but at the same time, it's not so easy. Like, it feels wrong to have to move your king out of the center. But the fact is that, as you guys notice, the king on d4, the king on e4, it's actually not that great. It's one of the few cases where bringing the king in the center can actually cause you to go wrong. And that's exactly what happened. He played king d4, threatening the bishop. But now after bishop b3, all of a sudden the rook and bishop are both hanging. So Alekseenko, of course, had a plan for this. He was planning to sack the exchange here. And sack it for a position where he has opposite bishops. And this is also quite interesting. I will say that it's one of those positions, again, where I think with most accurate play, black can maybe get something. But it's very, very difficult in practice. Yes, Topalov Aronian, yes, I remember. I forget. Was that the game Topalov sacked 2 exchanges? Or was it Aronian? I don't remember, but yeah, there are quite a few. But Topalov was famous for it because he was willing to sacrifice an exchange without anything too concrete for it. He would just do it because he thought practically it was quite good. And of course, the first one who really did it a lot was Petrosyan. He was famous for sacking the exchange for positional reasons. But the fact is now it's just a very common thing in a GM's arsenal. So almost any GM knows how to sack the exchange and knows when it's decent, when it's not, and kind of has a feel for that. So it's just one of the things you want to learn to get good at. And I don't just mean only GMs do it, right? Like every player kind of can learn it. But it's a good skill to learn because I think that a lot of the times, especially of a position like this, the 2 bishops are so annoying and so nasty that sacrificing an exchange for a dangerous pawn is actually worthwhile, because here let me put it this way. I think that black is probably better with best play. But because there's no more dark squared bishop, the king can sit pretty on d4 and never be unsafe. The pawn on e5 and bishop on d6 control so many squares. To actually win this position from a practical point of view is so difficult, even if you think you're better here. And to give you an idea, I think that in this position, Grischuk already plays a slight error. And I think it's kind of almost a logic error, in my opinion, more than anything else. So I'm curious what you guys would play here as black. Thank you. So what would you guys try? Because I think that it's a position where the best move is not altogether obvious. So a4 is what you guys thought right away. And this was also Grischuk's move. And I think it's a mistake. And I'll show you why in a moment. But what else have you guys got? I would love to play rook c8, but at the moment rook c8 runs into rook takes b3. So you need to deal with your bishop hanging first. So a move like this, I find an invaluable tool is processes of elimination. So first up, let me ask you a different question. If you're white here, what piece are you most looking to improve? What piece is definitely not the best here? Bishop c2 is possible. I don't hate bishop c2, I'll tell you that. But you have to keep in mind, yes, so Doug has it right, which is that the knight on f3 is really not the best piece. It looks nice, but the fact is, like the e-pawn's defended, the king doesn't need to be defended. The knight does nothing there. The knight would love to move to d2, to e4, to f6. So given that, the move a4 I think is bad because it allows knight d2 with tempo. So a move like bishop e6 looks logical, but that allows knight g5 with tempo. Because now, this knight is just annoying, and if you play a move like h6, then I'm happy to go to e4 if I need to. I could consider taking the bishop as well, by the way. But so you're kind of walking into knight g5 with tempo. Bishop c2 makes a lot of sense, but you're also forcing me to improve my rook, and I'm not so sure your bishop belongs there. So for example, a move like rook c3 looks a little annoying. And now if you try rook c8, maybe even bishop c7 and a5 hangs. I don't know. So believe it or not, I actually like the move as bishop g8. And the whole point is that now rook c8 is coming, and knight g5 does not come with tempo in any way, shape, or form. And rook c3 is met very clearly by rook c8. So if rook c3, you play rook c8. And this is now possible, but there's no bishop hanging on c2. So if you need to, you have the time to play a4. And now you don't have to worry about the pawn hanging. So I think that bishop g8 is actually a very nice move, but not altogether obvious. So a move like a4 is easy to play quickly because you want to secure your bishop. But the problem is now the knight improves with tempo because now the bishop has to move. The bishop moves, and now knight e4. And here I think that white's already getting oodles of counterplay because they got a knight move for free. So sometimes these positions are all about that one or two details. So Grischuk plays bishop f5. And here, rook c3 is actually a very desirable move, but unfortunately after bishop takes e4, you just lose. Because you can play rook c7 check, but after king up, king takes bishop, you still walk into this. So that would be very unfortunate. So instead he plays the move rook e3. And here bishop takes e4, rook takes e4. So once again, we end up in a very complex endgame. White's down the exchange for a pawn. But here, his centralized king, his bishop on d6, his pawn on e5, these pieces are so, so good. And when you have pieces like this, even when you're down the exchange, it's just so difficult for your opponent to play. And I would say that it's just really tough. So this kind of position, I feel like it's one of those where there's a practical element to it, and then there's an objective element. I would say objectively, black is, fine. And black's maybe even a tad better in some lines or whatever, although it's very close to equal. But at least from a practical point of view, playing this for black is very difficult. Because you have to deal with the centralized king, you have to deal with this powerful e-pawn. So it's just a type of position I would really like to avoid. And I feel like if black had kept more pieces on the board, they would have had more of an opportunity to try to make white's king feel uncomfortable in the center. You notice all those lines where the king was feeling uncomfortable. Now, they don't really have that opportunity. So this position actually becomes very, very tricky. So Grischuk plays rook f8, which is kind of clever. He's using the pin to activate his rook. The only problem is now there's nothing blockading that e-pawn. So white plays king e3. It looks a little funny, but he's trying to play rook takes a4 at some point. So then rook goes back to e8. And here rook takes a4 runs into, of course, rook d6 again. So he plays king f4 instead. Rook a8, rook b4, rook a7, and now the king comes marching back. King f7. And here there are different options. King d5 is an option. He chooses rook b6 to prevent the king from going to e6, because king on e6 would be a very, very good blockader. So he tries rook c8, bishop to b4, and rook a c7. So he's actually surrendering to the fact that he can't block the e-pawn. Blocking the e-pawn will be an ultimate success. But he just really can't quite do it. White plays king d5, and now e6 check is coming. So black chooses to activate his rooks instead. So he plays rook c2. This is very risky looking. But the fact is he's trying to activate his rooks and basically say that you're not going to queen the e-pawn. I can defend against it long enough. But once again, this kind of position is so, so difficult. It's really, really complex to play and really, really difficult. So he plays e6 check. And here, once again, it's one of those positions where it still looks really dangerous, but if you turn on the computer, it says every single move is a dead draw. But from a human perspective, at least, this is such a difficult position to play. So it's just something to remember, because a lot of people will look at the computer evaluations and think, okay, it's just a dead draw. But the fact is that for human beings, it's very difficult. Like for me, the move king e8 looks suicidal. But the fact is, it's still a draw, because the best white can do is rook b7, and now black plays this, and then check, and then this, and then here. So this is one way the game could end. They could play king to g8, and now you can play king d6, for example. Rook takes g2, king d7. And this is another thing. Once you get a pawn on e7 defended by a bishop, it's worth an exchange. Like, even though it's down a full exchange now, that pawn on e7 is a monster. But the fact is that after king f7, the best white can do here is to just play rook e6. This is a funny move because you're threatening rook e8, which is e8 queen, which is very strong. Notice how the bishop guards the d6 square, very important, or the d2 square. So the best black has here is check. White goes to d8, now threatening queen again, and then this kind of weird perpetual. So basically everything ends in a draw, but as we know, Grischuk was trying to win this, right? So he plays king f6. Rook b7. g5. So moves like rook d8 don't do anything because I can actually play rook d7. And it's quite an embarrassing situation. After takes, this bishop controls all the squares. And this pawn's going to queen with check, right? So because the pawn's going to queen with check, you actually just resign here, which is very, very sad. So g5 was played in the game. Notice how rook f7 check would be very nasty potentially. So he plays g5. Rook takes h7. Rook takes g2. And again, the mess continues. King d6. King g6. Rook back to h3. Here you have choices. You could bring the rook out the other way, but rook h3 actually makes a lot of sense to me because you want to try to improve your rook somehow. And sometimes bringing the rook in front of the pawn or behind the pawn is actually a really good thing. So this position actually was a bit confusing to me. Again, the move Grischuk played, this is again where I don't like computer, because of course I checked my analysis. It's such a complex position that I wanted to check my analysis. And what I found funny was I thought Grischuk's move here for sure was a mistake, and computer just doesn't care. It thinks it's fine. But I think from a human perspective, his move is a slight mistake. So what would you guys play as black here? Because for me, I definitely had a clear favorite move. To be fair, I was also trying to draw and not win. So maybe that was part of it. But how would you guys play as black here? Yeah, rook e2. This is the move I like as well, because I want to get my rook behind the pawn to ensure that bad boy does not queen. So after e7, for example, I play rook a8, and if king d7, I check. And I don't think that white ever is going to win this, because the two rooks actually do an excellent job guarding against the e-pawn. So for me, playing rook e2 is just a very natural thing, because I just don't want this pawn to queen. In the game, however, he played the move g4, so he's forcing stuff, but it allows the move rook e3 by white, and I think this is just too annoying. Now all of a sudden you can definitely lose. That e-pawn is very, very strong. But once again, I think that Grischuk was still keeping in mind that he wanted to win. And that sometimes skews how you play a position. And I would say that unless you're in truly a must-win game, you want to make sure you view the position objectively, because, you know, if you try to win a position where you should be trying to draw, it's very likely you just lose, because you're going to play too ambitiously, and in the end it just costs you. And that's really what happens here. He plays rook takes h2, white plays king d7, and here once again you have to kind of decide your defensive setup, and it's a very difficult thing to do because this e-pawn's just getting shoved in, right? And because it's supported by this beautiful king on d7, the bishop on b4 and rook on e3 are very strong, you have to kind of defend against it in an odd way. But I do think it's very important, and this is true of a rook endgame concept too. Where do you think the c8 rook should go in general? Where should it go in general? To a8, I agree. And then to me, this is like the three file defense, or whatever you want to call it, right? The against an a pawn, because the whole point is that after e7, you want to be able to check the king in a lot of cases. Now here, I would be careful, because if you start checking the king too prematurely, I'm going to do this, and the e-pawn's going to queen now. So you have to play rook h7 first to create a pin. But the whole point is that now it's very, very annoying to ever queen that e-pawn. So after something like bishop c5, trying to prevent rook a7 check, I play king f6. And again, there are many, many options. I just want to show you kind of a sample variation here. Rook e1, king f5, and the whole idea is that I want to advance my king. So the whole point is you can't go to f8 because I'm going to take you. So you have to play something like king c6. And now I can play rook c8 check, rook e8, rook a8, and it's just really, really hard to make progress here, because the rook on h7 pins the pawn and the rook on a8 guards everything. So it's just a very tricky position to make progress, but I think this was what black should have tried. In the game, he played rook h8, which I don't know. I think it's a little bit passive. I think the rook on h7 is often going to be stronger than the rook on h8. So Alekseenko plays e7. And here, once again, I think he could have tried king f5. The main idea is that if a move like bishop d6, you play rook a8, it doesn't change much. And if you try queening, I'm going to be just too fast, because I can play rook takes e8, rook takes e8, rook takes e8, king takes e8. And now the plan is to get the king to b3. So I play king e6. Notice how I'm shouldering. I'm not going this way, right? Because that would allow something like this, maybe. So I'm going here to keep this king out of the game. And now I'm pushing and going for this. So you force bishop c5, you attack the bishop. And the whole point here is that no matter what happens for white's bishop, you force the bishop here and then queen. And you separate it from the a-pawn. This is a common drawing technique. So I think that king f5 would have drawn. But notice how black has to be very careful and already be trying to draw. But you also see how much leeway there is in a chess game we've shown a bunch of mistakes. Some of them maybe technically aren't big mistakes. And overall, these guys have played a really nice game. It's really hard to play these kind of positions. But I would also say that, you get a lot of opportunities, but you have to calculate one of them accurately because at some point the opportunities run out. So black plays here, which I think is already asking for it a bit. Bishop d6, which is a nice move, trying to guard against the g-pawn. So here, if king f5, for example, rook e5 check, I think, is quite decent. With the idea that if king f6, you go here and you fork the pawns. So they actually have to go up, which looks crazy. But now you check, and here it gets just really crazy. The main line I have goes king e3, taking the pawn, rook g8, rook b4. The problem is if takes, then you take here, and that's the draw. So here, rook a8, a4, king d2. So the idea is they're trying to push the pawn. Rook f4, and now you pin. And maybe black's holding on. But this is very difficult to find for any human being. This is obviously not a human line. But just to show you how complex this gets, you have to find all these crazy moves. So rook a8 was played, and here white plays bishop c7. Here queening is actually much closer, but I think it's still a draw. Like I looked into this a while, and the basic idea is that you just keep back here. You don't want to go for king e4 now, because if you try to go for this, you're just going to lose, because I take the pawn for free. So you actually want to play king f6, and the idea is that you just wait with the king, and your object is to basically go for this corner. So you do this and go for the a8 corner. And I don't think there's a great way to stop you, so that probably should end in a draw. But it's also not simple, right? Like, even after analyzing this, like, it's not completely obvious that you should draw. But I think it's just enough. So instead, white plays bishop c7. Notice how even Alekseenko, even though he doesn't have a shot at first place in the tournament, is still really doing his best to win. And this is a common theme, right? That, like, even if you're out of the tournament, even if you're in the bottom places, you still want to be fighting as much as you can to get those points. And he really wanted this full point, and to his credit, he really got it. So once again, I think rook h7 maybe is a better defense. He plays rook g8, rook e4, rook check, and rook takes a4. And here I thought his technique was really, really nice. So if rook h7 here, you can play bishop g3 and simply blockade the pawn. King h4 he tried, so rook e4, a4. So notice he can't play queen yet, because if he tries to queen, you run into rook takes and then rook takes, and this should be a draw in endgame. It's still tricky to sometimes draw like this, but obviously that's not what he wants. So he plays a4, a5, and notice the pawn still can't advance so easily. So rook h7, king c6. They repeat a couple times, but then he goes here. And again, maybe black could have shown better defense, but it's still pretty losing here. He plays rook e8, king d7, rook check, rook back, and now he's simply going to snack on that pawn. But bishop d8 is a nice kind of final touch. The idea being that if you try to play rook takes e7, I can take with check and play behind the pawn, and this should be an easy win. If you try taking this bishop, I take with check. And so you can't try any shenanigans here. Actually, the shenanigans wouldn't work anyway. But this is completely winning, of course. So he plays king f5. And now he takes the rook and plays king f8. And that is all she wrote, because there's no way to stop the e-pawn queening with check. So overall, just a really, really nice game by Alekseenko. And just an example of what can happen if you try to push too hard. But in general, just a really fascinating game, a really interesting endgame that could have gone either way. So I hope you enjoyed the game. I hope you enjoyed the analysis. This week on Thursday, I will not be doing your YouTube classes. Talia will be doing that because I'll be doing commentary for something else. But enjoy that. And in general, I'll be here next week. So I will see you guys then. And have a good night. Or morning or whatever it is where you are.